Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're thrilled you're here to join us. Denison Consulting, we offer these webinars and invite in different guest speakers to have conversations with us about top of mind issues. We're thrilled about today's session, which is going to look at strategic performance and culture building. And our two speakers for today have great experience in corporate. They also do some executive development and research, and it just is going to be really exciting. So first, let me introduce Dr. Stephanie Phipps. She's at Oklahoma State University. Her dissertation research took place in the private equity, and she looked at organizational culture and leadership attributes. And so we'll hear about that thread. That's a thread with both Stephanie and she's joined with Valerie Thomas, our vice president of consulting at Denison. And the two of them have known each other for over a decade, and they've done a lot of collaborative work together around leadership, culture, and strategy. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to the two of you, and let's get started. And I'll start sharing my screen so the audience can see. And audience, just so you know, you can post any questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll be capturing those, and time permitting, we'll respond to those, if not now, following the session. And everyone will receive a copy of the recording and materials afterwards. So again, welcome to everybody. And Stephanie, I'll switch it over to you and Val.
Good morning. Super excited to be here today. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. As Margaret said, Valerie and I have worked together. One of the examples we'll give today is a group that we worked on together, and I think kind of ties directly into strategic performance and what we'll be talking about. So let's get started. So looking more specifically into what we'll look at is really how aligning culture and strategy, and it's particularly intentional culture and strategy initiatives, will directly lead to stronger financial performance. And we'll show this through both an applied or a practical lens that we've seen, but also through a research lens, so we can show the validity and reliability that exists there. We'll look at the research, as Margaret said, through a time lens, but it applies beyond a time lens. Specifically, this example will be to show a complete difference between strategies. So looking at a short-term private equity group, which has a more simple strategy, versus a longer-term traditional type organization that has a lot more complex strategy because of the longevity and the additional expectations existed, or that they're trying to achieve there. And then looking at the dynamic environment that we live in today, we all know that this is a pretty complex time for businesses. There's a lot of things coming at them that aren't necessarily just tied to the bottom line. And so how do you exist in that environment and still keep your focus on bottom line driven initiatives? And then looking at that through some case studies. And then where do we go from here? What else do we need to look at through leadership, how leadership connects to the strategy and culture that we're trying to put in place? So looking at the big picture, it will be no surprise to anybody in the corporate world today that top management teams have to focus on financial performance. That is the end all and the be all of where we start. Now, it's not through that lens that we only focus. There are other things. Stakeholder objectives are key, and they may not have a direct link to financial performance, but they all should tie indirectly to that overall goal. And getting the attention of top leadership teams or CEOs, if you don't start with financial performance, culture and strategy are things that are important, but if they don't tie to financial performance, it's hard to get that attention of the top leadership team. So keeping that in mind is always critical. And then thriving over time. So again, one of the examples we'll give will be a short time frame, and that element is not as important. But for those traditional type organizations, whether they be public or private, that key element is going to be something that they have to include in their strategy as well. And then the alignment of culture and strategy is what we'll focus on, how that will lead to optimal firm performance. And then learning how to adapt in the fast-paced world that we live in today. We can say, business has always been fast-paced, that's nothing new, but we have things that are being thrown at us today that we've never seen before. And so this time is different. There is a dynamic shift that we're seeing that we are going to have to adjust to. So next slide, yes. So when we think of strategy, the first thing that a lot of times comes to mind when you're in the heat of the business day and you're thinking about our business strategy, we think about things like SWOT analysis or competitive forces or what kind of competitive advantage are we going to have? What type of strategy are we going to put in place? Is it a cost leadership? Is it a focused or a differentiation strategy? Those words and terms come up all the time when we're talking about building our strategy. And you hear this in leadership meetings all the time. Let's shift to the next screen. But in reality, strategy is bigger than just the business strategy or how we're going to build our future plan. And I think these concentric circles kind of showcase how strategy, culture, and leadership, as they overlap, and they don't have to. You could have a business strategy that really doesn't overlap with your culture, and you can have leaders that never talk directly to those things to your organization. But as they start to overlap and come together, that's where you start to see that middle circle optimal performance start to build. Now, the closer they come together, the larger that performance space becomes. And so the alignment of culture, strategy, and leadership are really the objective and the goals that we're trying to get to. And culture offering those collective assumptions, the idea that how we operate as an organization, we all understand within the organization, and we're working off of a collective understanding. The strategy then just being the plan as we develop it, as it ties back to our mission and vision. And then the leadership as we develop and repeat that communication and that plan throughout the organization at all levels, that's going to guide the strategy, and that's going to guide the understanding of the strategy and the culture throughout the organization. These three are very important that they stay connected. And again, as they overlap more and more, the more aligned they become. So looking at the research that I did, and again, the idea was really to say, okay, how do we have two distinct and distinctly different strategies? And how do we compare them based on the strategies themselves and the effect they have on culture? And so that's why the short-term, short timeline private equity type of culture, and then your traditional organizations are very distinct in not only the strategies that they have, but anticipated the culture that they might elicit. And so a short-term or private equity strategy is really very simple. It has one objective, and that is, how do we build and create value and accrete value within, whether it's assets that we're building or a business that we're building, and then how within a very short period of time do we turn that, sell it, and make a profit. And so with short-term private equity type companies, they intentionally hire and find a workforce that has certainly the skill sets that it's aligned with what they're trying to do. They don't really have time to develop that skill set. They need it to walk in the door. And also with the workforce that's motivated to work on very quickly, but also understanding that it's going to end very quickly. And then there's a potential of starting over and doing that again on another project. But the idea is that it's project after project. It's not a long-term strategy where you're going to have time to build and grow and develop. And so looking at it through the lens of the strategy, and then I took those private equity companies and actually ran the Denison survey against that to say, okay, what kind of culture would a strategy like that look like? So next slide. And the surprising result, I suppose, is the fact that even though the culture results were similar in an outcome to the financial results, they were different in the sense that, a little bit as expected, consistency, involvement, the two dimensions of the Denison survey that really take time to develop, that take time to grow within an organization, they were not as strong as traditional companies. However, the mission and adaptability, and again, the need for short-term organizations to adapt quickly to the environment, both internal to the business and external, so that in that short period of time they can offload those assets. It created an environment where they had to have what's called swift trust. They didn't have time to develop relationships the same way a traditional organization would. They had to walk in the door believing that everyone was aligned with that one objective and everybody was focused on that strategy in a very similar way. And so that swift trust, even though there was some weakness in consistency and organizational development in terms of skill development, the ability to overcome that through mission and adaptability offered similar outcomes in overall firm performance. So what does that mean to us today? Not everybody's operating in a private equity environment. A lot more companies are operating in those traditional type organizations, again, whether they're private or whether they're public organizations, a similar setup. But what we see today is that because of the swift dynamic shifts that we're seeing in the external environment and the internal environment, it's creating required change within organizations that makes companies have to react more quickly, much more quickly than they used to. So things like hybrid or remote work. There has been remote work for a long time, but the explosion in the number of companies that are doing it, the explosion in the number of companies that are trying to work through how hybrid will work with the culture that they currently have set, how are they going to shift? Do they need to shift? Do they want to shift? Those are all questions that feed into the culture and the strategy that they're building and developing and changing. And then things like stakeholder-driven initiatives, the kind of advent of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, business and community partnerships, volunteerisms. We see a workforce today that's more inclined to want to come to work for companies that have things that motivate them beyond just a career and a wage. And so how do you develop, or do you develop other things that your workforce might want to be involved in? And then changes in governmental policy, technology. We see huge changes in technology today. And then multi-generational workforce. We have 5 generations operating in our workforce today. We've never seen that before. And the blend of that workforce is going to be unique to each organization. And so how do you take that, use that to the advantage? Again, build that into your strategy, build that into your culture. And then looking at the workplace environment itself, we've always known that we needed to align the skill sets that we needed with the work that was being done, and set a workplace that was aligned with what employees wanted. But that's even more important today. We have to ensure that we not only have the skill set, but that the vision that the employees, or the motivation, or the environment that our employees want to work in, that if they're aligned with the workplace itself, then they're going to be much more likely to understand and be engaged with the strategies that we have and be excited about the culture that we're offering. And then we have to find ways to offer the environment that it supports those employees. So it's a symbiotic relationship here. You have to have a certain skill set. There are employees that you want to encourage to come to work for you. How do you build an environment that they want to come to work in, and vice versa? How do you find that group of employees that will fit in the environment that you feel that you need for your organization? And companies are going to have to be nimble and think of ways to be creative, to create an environment that both works for the strategy that they have and want, and then also brings in that group of employees that fit. So looking at culture, and my guess is that that most of you have probably seen the iceberg example on culture. The visible culture is above the waterline. We see the hidden culture is below. And as you can see, there's a lot more below the waterline than there is above. So there's a lot of culture that goes on that even as leaders, we don't see sometimes. It's creating on its own. And that's the idea that where you have a culture that is not explained or driven by leadership and employees that are aligned with it, the more hidden that culture is, and the more difficult it is to align with anything, including strategy in the organization. But when you have a strategy, and by the way, strategy sits on top of culture. It is a part of culture. It's the visible part. It's the plan. It's the thing that we talk about. It's the thing that we might have written documents on, saying this is our strategy. It exists. And where it aligns with that culture, it creates a sustainable competitive advantage, and a sustainable competitive advantage in a way that can't be imitated by our competition. So it creates a unique environment. Culture drives strategy, and strategy drives culture. So making sure that as you create one and as you are talking through one, it's affecting or driving the other. And then leadership, if you'll see to the right of that picture, leadership is continuously communicating and then translating the strategy into the day-to-day work of your employees, because they may see the strategy. You may have beautifully written posters around the workplace that says, here's our strategy. But if the worker can't see what their role is in that, then it just becomes noise. And so you really need to communicate and translate that strategy into what each person is doing in the organization and how it aligns with that strategy. The better you do that, the better that you align your culture, your strategy, and then that communication piece is absolutely key. It starts to bring that waterline down, and you start to see more of the culture and the strategy, not just you, but everyone in the organization, which is really what you're trying to get to, is unhide as much of that strategy and culture as you possibly can. And so here's a case study. This is an organization that Valerie and I both worked on. You can see it's just a few years ago, but I think it gives a good example of how focusing and aligning strategy and culture really can pay huge dividends. So looking at the 2016 Circumplex, this was the first time the company had engaged with Denison. It's the first time they had looked at culture in any formal way, and really looked at it through the lens of, okay, where do we stand? Here's where we think we stand. Most companies, I think, are always a little shocked when they do their first survey. This company was no different. And my role was within the organization. So I was looking at it from the standpoint of where do we need to improve the culture. And Valerie helped us come in and run it. Once we looked at this and saw that there were great deficiencies overall, and realizing that where we really wanted to focus, or where we felt the start should be, was on that mission segment, because the strategy lives in that mission area, and we could see there was a lot of weakness there. And so some of the things that we did coming out of that was to communicate both through meetings, small group sessions, departmental meetings, as well as creating actual documents that showed what the goals of the organization were, how the intention to get there, what steps were going to be taken, and then long-term, what the vision was. How were we going to create this vision, or what was the vision that was created? And then how do we implement the strategic direction and goals to get there? And then aligning those goals again with each department and then with each employee within that department. So we had lunch and learns to kind of engage and get people involved. We created spreadsheets or flyers that we could communicate with. But the idea was that each leader in the organization engaged with small groups or one-on-one throughout this 18-month period. And then you can see the results on the right the next time the survey was done. It was a huge improvement. It was actually a greater improvement than was expected. One of the surprises might have been, well, wait a minute, you said you focused on mission, but look, the color wheel really expanded in every category. And I think the reason for that was you can't just focus on the goals and objectives without also creating or developing your employees. And so there was unintentional, maybe, or not directly related focus on involvement, but there was still focus on involvement to get to the outcomes that we were hoping for mission. And the same, without adding resources in terms of the number of employees or new technology, the coordination and integration had to be focused on because we had to become more efficient. We had to focus on things that were going to take away time, tasks that didn't support or didn't create any value, and really focus on things that did. And then also through that development of vision, putting some focus on the external environment. What were others doing? What could we learn? And so again, even though the spotlight was on mission, there were other things that bled into that as well. And you can see the outcomes, the stated outcomes that we got from that were also definitely aligned with the overall objectives, aligning employee skills to the company goals, pursued growth opportunities, created a value-added culture. So the expectation was that every employee, we asked them to think through how can they add value not only to their role, but speak beyond their role. How can they add value to the department? How can what can leadership learn from the experiences of the employees? Again, whether it's within their role or beyond their role, just learning what they were finding, and then identifying and managing any risk that maybe was not perceived before, and then creating a culture of accountability. So making sure that everyone was accountable for not only the role that they had, but making sure that they held others accountable for their roles as well. And Valerie, do you want to talk about both some of the cases that we worked on, but also kind of a broader scope?
Yeah, absolutely, Steph. Thank you. And it just brings back great memories of the time we were spent there, and just want to highlight it. It was a business-led initiative, and you created that. So you got business line leaders involved in understanding not only the culture results, but also the strategy, and having those conversations where you're looking at the strategy and looking at the culture and figuring out how do we mobilize ourselves and mobilize the strategy moving forward. And I was pleased to see that you had such significant improvements. We look at 10 percentile point shifts as significant, and we think about that through the lens of people can probably tell you a story of what changed in either direction, and you surpassed that in so many of the areas of the model. But just real quickly, just to overemphasize, here's another example to kind of build the bridge between culture, strategy, and leadership. And this company, different company, but another client company that I had the pleasure of working with and still am working with them, they did their culture survey, but also did 360s. So they wanted to look at both, and the powerful message here is, as you can see, the culture results are pretty much mirror images of the combined from a 360 perspective. And those of you who aren't familiar with 360s, that is a feedback mechanism for development. And so leaders get feedback from their boss, their peers, their direct reports to help them understand how they operate day to day and how they're leading the organization and their efforts. So what really quickly here, I know we're almost out of time. Mission showed up here as well in Steph's example, and really what, as we unpacked the culture, but also the leadership profiles, a couple things really stood out. And one of those things was, we know what the strategy is. We understand, we're clear and aligned around the what, the why, and the how. We just don't necessarily know how we fit into that. So as Steph mentioned, really making sure that no matter what role you play in the organization, that you understand your connection and get excited around that vision, and really trying to bring that strategy to life, and making sure there's alignment around the goals and objectives. The other key thing was, a lot of leaders aren't equipped. They haven't had time or effort placed on their development in that strategic space. So a lot of capability gaps were showing up in this particular organization, and even from a self-leadership perspective. So that's that third piece. There's the how 20 or so leaders viewed themselves and provided their self-assessment. So again, I think it really demonstrates the need to bring strategy, culture, and leadership together in one conversation.
Yeah, so Steph and Valerie, we just have a couple of minutes before we wrap up here, and we've got some great questions. And maybe I'll start right where you left off here, Valerie, is question from the audience is, what does a 360 bring when the workforce fears speaking the truth or is trained to always agree?
No, it's a really great question. And I often hear that there is, one of the first things we ask is, what's your current mechanism for providing feedback? Is it a feedback enriched environment? Do people feel safe to say what they think and give each other feedback? And so with the 360, the benefit of it is, if you don't have a feedback enriched environment, you're building that muscle. You're starting to build it in a safe and confidential way. So the value of the 360 is people understand and they have a space to really help leaders through that development and their perceptions of how they demonstrate those 12 characteristics of leadership. So the value is, we understand how we're being perceived, and we can choose whether or not we want to create different experiences to manage some of those perceptions out there.
Great, thanks. We'll have time for one more. And then we have captured all the questions. And so just a reminder again, everyone will receive the recording and the PowerPoint, and we'll also provide contact so you can continue the conversation. But one of the individuals, back to the case study, Steph and Valerie, that you talked about, the 2-year comparison, the customer focus scale only showed modest improvements. How did leadership react to that or adapt to that?
Great question. And I will say the challenge, and it happened to be the industry that complicated this slightly, but there was a lot of confusion. We found out later, we did focus groups following the survey to really try to understand not just that question, but some other questions that existed as well. And what we found was there was some confusion around what customers were. So the idea that customers were not only those external, there are a lot of employees in this organization that were not directly customer facing. And so they sort of felt like, well, this doesn't apply to me. I can't answer the customer question. And so it didn't, even in the 18 model, there was still, we actually changed the language from customer to stakeholder in the survey itself. And there was still confusion around, okay, what is a stakeholder? So I think for that particular organization and that industry, it was just a more complicated field to survey. We actually got more feedback through focus groups and directly asking than we were able to get through the survey, but that's the answer.
And I think we also help them see through the lens of we have internal and external customers and stakeholders. So let's think about the behaviors that we see when we're working across our functional areas. Those are our key stakeholders within the organization. So putting that lens on, I think, helped a little bit too, Steph.
Yes, yes.
Great. So we're at our 30-minute mark and want to hold true to that. We had a lot more great questions. And so everyone will be receiving the recording, and the materials will also provide email contacts for both Steph and Val, so you continue the conversation. Also want to bring up, Stephanie, do you want to talk about the Future of Work Summit?
Yeah, the Oklahoma State University has created a Center for the Future of Work. They did that in 2022, and this will be the first year that they're holding a Future of Work Summit. And so very excited about that. And I will be expanding on this conversation during a session with them, Unleashing the Power of Organizational Culture and the Impact on Financial Performance. August 31st through September 1st is the dates of the summit. So if you are interested in registering, they have provided a code for an additional $50 off that will be available through August 18th for anybody that's in the area. So would love to have any and all join.
Great, thank you. And I know there's been several questions in here about executives and leaders. Next month, our webinar will focus more on kind of that leader engagement, talking to global leaders and global companies. So we'll continue the conversation then. But for now, I just want to thank all of you who are able to join us. And to our guest speakers, Stephanie and Valerie, this was a great conversation, and everybody enjoy the rest of your evening, afternoon, or morning, whatever that may be. Thanks.
Thank you.